So for the extra credit for this one, we wanted to interpolate the class name and the children. And I give you the example of template literals to kind of give you an idea of the fact that we do interpolation all of the time in pretty much every language. There's some way to say, hey, I've got this type of a thing and I want to put that type of thing into this other thing. And template literals are a perfect example of that. I have this variable, it says sup, and this subject that says world, and I want to put those together with a space between them. And so I'm going to do this backtick. We'll get our dollar and then our curly brace, and then we enter JavaScript land. So I'm going to actually copy this and we're going to walk through this together because I think this is a really important key point to get an understanding of. Then we'll come over here and we'll play around with the JSX version of all this stuff. So here we have our JavaScript variable, and we're defining another JavaScript variable. And when we get into this single quote, that takes us out of JavaScript land and into string land. And anything we put in here is going to be considered a string. We could say const foo equals bar. Well, if we put another closing quote, then we're going to wind up in a funny situation. But we could say const foo is 3, and like it's just going to interpret that as a string. We actually have the same thing right here in our HTML document. We're starting out with HTML, and we're just running through all of this stuff. And if we end up with a style tag, now we're in CSS land here where we can say body color red. And look at that. The color is now red. Fancy that. So we exit HTML land and enter CSS land using this style tag. And we do the same thing with our script tag. So we exit HTML land and enter JavaScript land. And then we can do all kinds of JavaScript stuff. And then we close that script tag. And now we're back in HTML land again. And so we're doing the same thing with this template literal. We do this backtick. Now we're in string land. Stuff is a string right here. And then when we do this dollar curly brace, that is exiting string land and getting us back into JavaScript land. So this is interpolation at work right here. We're interpolating one type of thing inside of another thing. So interpolating JavaScript inside of this string. So this is where we can put any sort of expression. We have greeting, really anything that evaluates to a string. So we can call to uppercase right here. That evaluates to a string. We can do a regular function call like get first character or something like that if we had that function defined. You can do anything in here as long as it ultimately evaluates to a string, then you're going to get the expected result for this specific interpolation. Once we close with that closing curly brace, we're now exiting JavaScript land and entering string land again for that one space, and then we exit string land and go into JavaScript land, and then we finally exit JavaScript land, enter string land again, but then we immediately exit string land, and now we're back into JavaScript land. So we're going to do this exact same thing for our JSX with interpolation. So if I wanted to take this container here and make a class name variable out of that, and we'll say this class name is container, and then we'll take this hello world, and I'll say children equals hello world. So how am I going to get these two variables interpolated into these two positions? So we'll start with the children here first. The way that we do this in a template literal string is a dollar and then a curly brace and then a closing curly brace, and then you put whatever you want to in there. In JSX, you just drop the dollar and you just have this open curly brace and then the closing curly brace. Whatever you have between that is JavaScript stuff. So we'll say children right here, and that evaluates to something that React can do with, and so then it just takes it from there. And then for our class name, it's actually very similar. Rather than doing the double quotes here, we're going to do that open and closing brace, and then we'll say class name right here. And of course, these don't have to be those names. This can be greeting, and this can be whatever we want to call it. We could say my class name. And so long as those two variables are the same, then that will work just fine. And you notice we get a refresh. Everything's working fine. Let's take a look at the compiled version of all of this stuff. So we have our variables here, greeting and my class name, and then our element is a React create element call with the type of div, and then class name is simply being assigned to my class name. So there's actually not a whole lot of special stuff going on here. Let's go ahead and we'll add an ID of, string, something that's like directly in there so we can compare that. So with the ID that's just a literal string, it's just going to stick it there. But once you put in interpolation, that basically is just telling Babel, just don't do anything here. Just remove those curly braces and make that be the property of an object. So that's why doing a function call in here, we could say to uppercase, that's going to work just fine, because ultimately that results in just passing that exact same thing that we had in the curly braces to the property of that object. We get the exact same thing with the children prop here. So if I said to lowercase right here, and we save this, now we can take a look at the result here, and we'll see that it's just passing greeting.toLowercase. So it works out just fine, because that's just JavaScript at that point. So interpolation is really just a mechanism to switch you from JSX land, which we enter when we do this open angle bracket here. It switches you from that JSX land into JavaScript land, and it basically just tells the compiler, don't do anything with this, just insert whatever's in here at that position of the code that you generate based on this JSX. One other thing that hopefully is starting to become clear to you now is you cannot do statements inside of these open and curly braces. So I couldn't say if greeting is hi, then I don't even know what you would type here, like another curly brace, I guess, and then would you return a value? That wouldn't really make any sense. So you can't do statements, and hopefully it makes sense why, because if you were to try and say, okay, React create element, let's create element, create a div, and I don't care about props, but then here I want to say if greeting equals hi, then like what would you put there? That doesn't make any sense to put a statement as an argument to a function call. And so that's why you can't do statements inside of here. You also can't do statements inside of template literal either. You can just say, okay, interpolate this. Like that's a syntax error as well. So it's a very similar type of limitation, I guess you might consider it a limitation. But that's basically something to keep in mind, is that you cannot do statements in here. And so it's kind of useful to do a little bit of studying up on what the difference between a statement and an expression is in JavaScript. Pretty much an expression is something that evaluates to a value, and a statement is some imperative logic that you can apply for your program. And we do this all the time. Like this is a statement here where we're creating a variable. You wouldn't be able to create a variable inside of these curly braces. So pretty much most of the time I find myself either doing a just a regular variable interpolation here, or sometimes I might do a ternary. So I can say greeting is hi, then I'll say it was hi. Otherwise, I'll just have the greeting be there. So sometimes you'll find JSX code that does this. And actually, this is pretty common to do ternaries like this inside of JSX. But if ternaries are like freaking you out, then you can say, here, let's define the children. And we'll say if greeting equals hi. Then we'll say children is it was hi. Otherwise, the children can be the greeting. And then from there, you can just interpolate children directly. So you can avoid those ternaries if that's not something that you're into. But I'm definitely a fan of the ternaries, and that's typically how I go about writing my JSX. But hopefully that makes sense, that you cannot put statements inside of these curly braces, just expressions. And then that basically tells the compiler, hey, I'm exiting JSX land, entering JavaScript land. Don't do anything with what's between these two. Just put it at the spot where this interpolation exists. And then Babel will just take that and say React create element, and it'll just pass that value directly there. And this right here is one of the coolest parts of React. It gives you that ability to mix your markup with some actual JavaScript language. So you don't have to learn any special syntax for how to repeat over a list or how to determine it, how to conditionally render something. You have all of the power of JavaScript at your fingertips, thanks to the fact that JSX exists within JavaScript, and you can switch between the two.